Greetings, everyone, and welcome to our Kwanzaa celebration. I'm Dr. Marilyn Harvey, Dean of Business Technology and Entrepreneurship here at Mount San Jacinto. And I'm going to share with you also my African name, which is Vanessa. So feel free to call me by that if you choose to do so. But if you need to get serious with me, you decide what that means, actually. But I just want to take a moment to just say welcome. And we are truly glad to have you here. We'll be learning about the principles of Kwanzaa, and we'll be celebrating Kwanzaa at the same time. So I'm not going to take up too much time with this greetings, but I'm going to turn it over to Brother Baye, who will be here to celebrate Kwanzaa with us, as well as provide us the educational context of Kwanzaa. Thank you for being here. You are all truly appreciated.
Asante
Dr.
Sana,
Baye.
Sister
Asante
Fanasa. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. My full African name is Baye Kesba Merah. And I'd like to start out by saying that my family given name is Dwayne Bradford. Depending on in African tradition, depending on which name a person uses with you determines how you approach and adjust to the conversation with them. So Baye will mean certain things to certain people. Dwayne will mean other things to other people. So it's good for everyone to know that. The second thing I'd like to do is say that we're going to start the process with a libation. On the African continent, nothing is official, ever is done official in traditional Africa without a libation. Three components of the libation. One, you must give thanks to the Creator by whichever name you call that Creator. Two, you must give thanks to the ancestors. And three, those of us who are responsible for the children who exist today, remind ourselves that we stand on their shoulders. So I'm going to do a libation with those three simple statements. And after each statement, I'm going to ask everyone in the group to say Ashe. Ashe is a Yoruba word that means it is so. That means it's a rough translation. It means more than that, but that's the best you can do in English. It is a firm statement, basically. So I'm going to get up first and do the libation. After the libation. We call upon the source of universal power, the creator by whichever name anyone uses that name, to bless this gathering of African people and family and friends and supporters, to provide us all with good health and vitality. We call upon our ancestors whose shoulders we stand on as African people, and all those other people who have shoulders of ancestors they stand on, to remove all obstacles from our path, provide us with clarity in everything we do, and give us the wisdom to move forward in togetherness. Finally, we call upon our responsibility to the children who are in the womb, the children who are in our laps, the children who depend on us to protect them and give them a place of safe harbor to grow and be nurtured and to be themselves and celebrate themselves in their Africanness or whatever culture that they are a part of. We ask ourselves to remember those children and have those children look up to us today. May the source of universal power hear us. May our ancestors and the motherland hear us. May those of the future hear us. Akera. Akera means it is done in the language of Bambara. So at this time, I would like to ask the elders in the room permission to speak. Asante Sana. That is another African tradition that we always ask elders permission to speak simply because in the African cosmos, Elders are the closest one to the ancestors because they will get there first in most cases before anybody else. So therefore, in that hierarchy of processes, it is always important to ask the elders permission before you go to do anything. As a matter of fact, in traditional Africa, even today, before a young person goes to do anything, if they're out in the bush, not necessarily the metropolitan area, they will go to the elders and ask permission. And as a result, the elders in some cases will have a fly swatter that is a symbol of eldership or kingship or chieftainship to bless them. And the elder will either do both of these or come up here and do that to them. So that's one reason for the fly swatter that you see that I have today. The next thing that I would like to talk to you about, put some things in perspective for you. My name is, as I said, Baye Kesba. I have a master's degree, Master of Science degree in rehabilitation counseling. I am a veteran, United States Navy. Over here are 3 more veterans. So I want to put that in perspective because some people think, well, Kwanzaa is like this thing, you got to be this certain way. And there's always a stereotype that comes with a lot of things that happen with Kwanzaa. But I want you to know the complexity of us as African people. We are composed of various components of life experiences, and we bring all of that process to the Kwanzaa process. Kwanzaa, which means first fruit in Kiswahili, an African language. I say all of this to say that now, as I begin to talk about Kwanzaa, I want to put Kwanzaa within a historical context. I don't know how many of you here are in your 70s, but if you're not, you weren't there in the 60s when Kwanzaa came into existence. I myself was a young teen at the time. I'm 72 now. At that time, there was a lot of social unrest in the United States. And African people in the United States were going through the civil rights movement. Some were going the Martin Luther King route. Some were going the Malcolm X route. Kwanzaa, created by Dr. Maulana Karenga, who still heads the Africana Studies Department at Long Beach State University, created the US organization, Organization US. And the Organization US is based on Kawaida theory. Now, if you don't know what Kawaida theory is, you're going to have to look it up. But in Kawaida theory, there's the concept of cultural nationalism. And the theory is that no people can begin to be self-determined until they have a cultural understanding of who they are and values and principles that they apply in the process of being culturally together. Their politics will mean nothing. Their economics will be nothing because they're not together based on a firm set of values and principles to function from. That's Kawaida theory in the general concept. And as a matter of fact, you can always confirm what I say because Dr. Karenga is not that far from where you are here in Menifee to begin with. So the creative Kwanzaa is still alive and well, still has weekly meetings, still has weekly conversations with people about Kwanzaa, and still is actively involved in developing the Africana Studies Department and heading it at Long Beach State University. So it's not my word. You can go to the source. And I always tell people, don't take my word for it, go to the source. As a matter of fact, he has a book out on Kwanzaa that's been out since the 90s that is the authoritative book on Kwanzaa. So any other type of conversation you get about Kwanzaa, you don't go back to that book. Chances are you don't know what you're talking about. And I'm just keeping that for real. The 60s were turbulent times. In 1966, I had not come back from the United States yet because my mother and father were teaching in Africa, and I was a child in Africa at the time, being immersed in French African school system in the country of Mali in 1966. So I was not stateside when Kwanzaa came into existence in 1966. I was on the African continent. However, There were a lot of things popping off in the Black world at that time in the 60s, and not just the United States. In the United States, we had riots going on, Detroit, Chicago, southern cities, LA, San Francisco. A lot of things were popping off at that time. And so there was unrest. At the same time, you had the African independence movements taking place on the African continent. And there were also independence movements taking place in the Caribbean. Black people declaring their independence from being colonies, European colonies. So all this activity was taking place. And Dr. Karenga, who was a young man at the time, and his organization felt that through their discourses with each other, that we had to have a concept of cultural nationalism. Of course, we can't bring people together to work together for self-determination unless they have a core set of values that they're practicing from, called the Nguzo Saba, 7 principles. Dr. Karenga had done a great deal of studying about the Nguzo Saba. He had been to the African continent. He had studied African principles of indigenous, cultural, human organization. And out of that process, he came up with 7 principles. And out of those 7, those were the core communal principles that allowed people to successfully work together for self-improvement. And Kwanzaa is about those 7 principles, the Nguzo Saba. Always is about that, nothing else. So if you start talking about anything else and you're not talking about the Nguzo Saba, you've missed the whole point of Kwanzaa again. So Kwanzaa is a cultural holiday. It is not a religious holiday. It is not a political holiday. It is not an ideological holiday in terms of Western culture. It is an African holiday that brings all African people together, regardless of what religion they believe in, regardless of what political position they take, regardless of what their views are. It says that regardless of what you think, we are still one people. Especially in the United States, where we all, for the most part that I can think of, come from an enslaved heritage. And not just the United States, because African people came from a slave heritage throughout the Western Hemisphere. Mexico, Central America, South America, and the Caribbean. In addition to Africa itself, which was colonized and also had to experience apartheid. So Kwanzaa is about bringing African people together in joy and in love for each other. That's all it is. Because if you can't love yourself, you can't love nobody else. It's that simple. If you can't appreciate who you are as an African person, a person of African descent, then you can't appreciate anybody else, although you may tell them all the time, because how we show our appreciation for ourselves is the culture that we practice and the values that come out of that culture that we practice. And if you don't have a value system that's based on something that brings people together in love for each other, then how can you have a politics that works? How can you have an economics that works? How can you have a society where you minimize the violence and crime between people in your neighborhoods and your communities? How can you not throw each other away because of material interest? That's what that whole conversation was about in the 60s with the younger generation. Now, you got to understand that the younger generation that I came from at the time, like I told you, when Kwanzaa came out, I was in my early teens. And I was sitting up under elders who were having conversations about how do we do a better job of taking care of our communities? How do we make sure we don't have homelessness? How do we make sure that we minimize the violence? How do we make sure we get the drugs out of our community, alcoholism, the drugs? How do we make sure that our children are raised in a safe community? These are conversations that we were having in the movement. So Kwanzaa was created within that context of the African American experience. You know, it's interesting for me, when I was in the 10th grade, Martin Luther King was assassinated. To this day, I remember when the teacher came into the classroom and told us. I was on the African continent when Malcolm was assassinated. I was in Mali when Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of the first African nation on the African continent, Black African nation, was exiled from Ghana. So all these social events taking place between Black people having conversations was at a time when most of us had a lot of love for each other. You know, most of us were addressing each other as brother and sister. You know, we were actually doing the Black Power sign all the time, not sometime, all the time. You know, all the African clothing, the introduction of African things, African got brought in by that generation of young Black people. The older Black people didn't do that, it was us. And out of that process came Black studies as well. It was us. They didn't exist before then. But we had a love for ourselves as African people. We wanted to create foundations for our people to be okay with each other. Thus, Kwanzaa was created out of Dr. Karenga's spirit. At the same time, his spirit, other young people were creating other types of organization, Black student unions. All these things were popping off at this time. We didn't know exactly what we were doing. We were coming from the heart, and you knew something had to change. We were not going to be Negroes, and we were not going to be niggas. That simple. We the ones that took Black, that had been a word that people would kill you over in your own community, and turned it into something positive. But we also connected Black to being African. It wasn't just Black by itself. All of a sudden, it just became this urban hip thing that just to be, I'm Black and I'm urban. I don't even know what that means. So it's connected to African culture, African tradition, African ritual. Kwanzaa came out of that as our way of redefining our African processes on our own terms because we had been cut off for a couple of centuries from where we came from. Cut off from our traditional languages, cut off from our traditional philosophies, cut off from our traditional spiritual system. All of that thing had been cut off, and our ancestors had to create something that makes sense in order to live beyond the insanity that they were living in at that time. And you can't show me a group of human beings that don't do that when they're in the middle of some type of situation like that. So I give praise to my ancestors for having the courage to still live, still survive, and have me and let me be here today, including my parents. Process. This is all, I'm still talking about Kwanzaa now. Because once I explain everything on the table, you're going to see how it's connected to what I'm saying right now. I want that to sink in. Kwanzaa, the Nguzo Saba, is a universal set of principles that other people have as well. They may describe it by different languages in different ways and different concepts, but it is the African American unique way of looking at their humanity and the rest of humanity at the same time. It doesn't exclude Black people from humanity because Black history is the missing pages of world history. Yes, we're part of world history. We are people with a history. But don't let the history get you to, don't let the history stop you at understanding that when I say we are historical people, that means that we had values, principles, and ideas that were unique to us, just as they were unique to people in Europe, just as they were unique to Native Americans, just as they were unique to Asian people, ours were unique to us. But when you brought us together with other people, based on our principles, we automatically saw their humanity. It wasn't anything that had to be explained to anybody. It was understood. So, umoja, unity. To strive for and maintain unity in the family, community, nation, as race is the first principle. That principle is what all the other principles lead to. Umoja. If you don't have the other principles, emoji doesn't work. First cultural principle, unity. To strive for and maintain, which means you have to work at it constantly. You can't talk about unity one day and then the next day go around talking about somebody else or stabbing somebody in the back or getting resentful and this, that. That's not unity. Unity, you have to work at it every day. Next principle is kujichagulia, self-determination. To define ourselves, name ourselves, create for ourselves, and speak for ourselves instead of being named, created for, and spoken for by other people. In other words, you have to know who you are before you can speak with yourself. Notice I'm not talking in a term of I, I'm talking about we. Because in the African tradition, individualism is not the primary purpose of people. I don't exist without you, you don't exist without me. So the concept of individualism does not exist in traditional African societies. So self-determination is not about me and just my career. Self-determination is how do we find ourselves as a cultural people? But you got to know what your culture is before you can define yourself as a cultural people. You got to know what your practices are, like libation. You got to know why you're doing Kwanzaa every year. You have to learn that there are other holidays out there like Nakambuka Day that you have to learn how to practice, because culture is the thing that you practice, not something that just happens to be there. Self-determination. The third principle is Ujima, collective working responsibility. Collective working responsibility requires us to constantly understand that unless we are working together, we have nothing as a people. And our brothers and sisters' problems are our problems, and our responsibility is to solve them together. In other words, you can't be sitting there talking about Ujima, collective working responsibility, if you're not talking about how do we make sure we all have a quality life together. For instance, how do I go through a process of going through a community college and I only study by myself and I don't help my brothers and sisters by saying, hey, we got to do a study group so we can all win? Because in traditional African society, there's no such thing as competition. It's communal. We move together. So therefore, everything that happens to us in our community, we are responsible for. We are responsible for looking after each other. We are responsible for looking after our children. We are responsible for making sure the elders are taken care of. We are responsible for making sure that everything that we do together. Important. The next principle is Ujamaa, cooperative economics. Ujamaa is connected to Ujima, which is connected to Kujichagulia, which is connected to Umoja. Cooperative economics means that we work together to create an economy that can sustain our communities, not because we hate somebody else, but because in order for our children to have quality lives, we got to make sure that we create an economic process that keeps them safe enough for them to study and know that they are protected. So cooperative economics is not about me going out, getting my business degree, starting my own entrepreneurship by myself and making this money and showing up on CBS to talk about my products. It goes way beyond that. When they had Black Wall Street in Tulsa, and by the way, my family is from Oklahoma and the Tulsa area. And I heard about Tulsa long before I got it in a school anywhere. My elders were talking about Tulsa and what happened in Tulsa, my father included, long before that happened. That was a concept of Ujamaa. Even when I grew up, when I was with my grandmother and stuff in Tulsa, when I was much younger, and there was a part of Black Wall Street that still existed at that time in the 50s, because I was a young child in the 50s. I remember visiting with my grandmother in Tulsa, and the whole neighborhood was thriving with Black businesses that did business with each other. That's important to remember. I used to ride in my grandfather delivered sodas, a delivery man for sodas, Anheuser Busch, all of that, and I would ride with him in a truck, and he would go through every store, just about every store that I can think of in my little young mind, in the black neighborhood where he was delivering his products to other African people in Tulsa who were running businesses. Ujamaa is about taking care of your people, you taking care of each other, and making sure everybody's okay. There was a time in the African American community, there was no system of other people coming and providing you with services. Either you provided it for yourself or you didn't. My father grew up in an orphanage, black orphanage outside of Tulsa, Oklahoma. And the only resources they got were from other black people in Tulsa in that orphanage, or Muskogee, or Okmulgee, where they got resources for them to be raised in that orphanage. And he went on to get a college degree. So that's another thing. I want to get away from the stereotype that everybody comes up, ain't it's just a struggle, and people love to talk about just the struggle of people who aren't successful. He came up in that. And the reason why he was able to do that so well is because of Ujima, collective working responsibility in the community, and Ujamaa. The next important principle that's tied to the others is Nia, purpose. What is your purpose? Now, I'm not talking about your individual purpose. I know you go to career counseling, they want to, well, what's your purpose? No, we're talking about collective purpose. What is our collective purpose? And that's tied, again, to Ujamaa, which is tied to Ujima, which is tied to Kujichagulia, that creates unity. Purpose. What is our collective purpose? What are we here for? Do we stand on the shoulders of our ancestors to collectively reproduce what they had the power to do? Or what do we do? We have to go back to our ancestors. Sankofa, which is an Ashanti word, it means return. It is no crime to go back and do what you have not done. So we go back. We look at the history, not the history of, oh, poor so-and-so and the slave, this and that. We go back to our ancestors who had the power to survive enslavement and still build all black towns, still build black economies within their own communities, still have pride in building the institutions that we've forgotten that they built. So if you know they laid that ground, you got no excuse. We got no excuse. That's Nia, purpose. Because when our children see that we have purpose, they know what to reach for as they grow older. And that purpose is to be with each other in celebration, love each other, work together with each other, make sure that we build something that is lasting for each other in the spirit of unity, which is unconditional love for each other. Not love me because I'm a Christian, not love me because I'm a Muslim, not love me because I didn't do this, not love me because I should be doing that, not love me because of this style, not this. Unconditional acceptance and love for each other. Next principle is Kuumba, creativity. Kuumba is I mean, dancing and singing is fine, but that's not Kuumba. Kuumba is, how do we become creative enough in our purpose, which is Nia, to come up with cooperative economics, Ujamaa, to help each other, Ujima, in order to create unity. That type of creativity. Some of it may become through the process of us, because we're spiritual people, and music can make us either go to doing what is great for each other or destroying each other. That's the power of music. That's the power of dance. That's the power of those spiritual type things that come out of you having a purpose. So creativity is, how do I help to make my neighborhood cleaner? How do I go to building up that we have green areas so our children understand what it is to have some type of relationship to nature? Because Our culture, original culture, we are earth people. We are connected to the earth. Our ancestors grew things. Their hands were in the earth. They were constantly in contact with the moon, the sun, the stars, the air, the mountains, the rocks, the insects, the animals. And they saw that as all interconnected. How do I take that creativity and all that philosophy and make it work for us together and make sure it's interconnected in the African tradition? Creativity, Kaumba. Finally is Imani, faith. But the faith we're talking about has nothing to do necessarily with our religious position. It has something to do with faith in our ancestors and our elders who have shown us the way of what can be done for us to reproduce it. Because if you ain't got faith, you don't have creativity that works. Your creativity is not connected to your ujamaa, your cooperative economics. Your cooperative economics is not connected to Ujima, collective work and responsibility. And self-determination doesn't work if you don't have faith and you work at it. And therefore, you can't have unity unless you are striving to work at that and make it happen. All 7 principles, all interconnected, all has everything to do for the welfare of us looking out for each other, loving each other unconditionally, so that when we come together at the end of each year during the 7 days of Kwanzaa, we come with joy for each other. It is called an ingathering. Every year, we come to Kwanzaa to celebrate us. We come to Kwanzaa to celebrate our achievements, us, our achievements together. We talk to each other. We have fun together. We laugh together. We do all of these things together. So therefore, everything in Kwanzaa is centered around the Nguzo Saba. And if you got a Kwanzaa and it's not centered around the Nguzo Saba, you don't have Kwanzaa. That's simple. So the important thing is to understand that Kwanzaa also was created for our children. My wife and I, Denise Adande over here seated, my wife and I have raised, our children were raised on Kwanzaa. We've been celebrating Kwanzaa for 39 years. Older than a lot of people in this room. But our children were raised on Kwanzaa. And they're in their 40s. There's not a year that goes by that my adult children don't say it's Kwanzaa time. And we have a Kwanzaa lighting every day for 7 days, and we talk about each principle of the Nguzo Saba when we light the candles. We discuss what we did in the past year that met the standards of the Nguzo Saba with each principle, and what we're going to commit to in the year to come in the family, with us, with ourselves, within our family and our community. We have that discussion and we make that commitment every year for each one of the principles. We have to practice it because the knowing is always in the practice. If you don't practice, you can't know. Knowing is more than the information you memorize in the classroom because you don't know it until you put it to work. I have a master's degree, like I said, in science and rehabilitation counseling. Until I put it to work in rehabilitation counseling, all I had was information. I didn't know until I put it into practice. After I put it into practice for a while, I knew how to be a professional without thinking about it twice. The same thing applies to everything in our lives, including the Nguzo Saba. You don't put it into practice, you don't know. You can talk about it, but you don't know. Once you put it into practice, you begin to understand things differently. I wanted to explain the Nguzo Saba before I went to explain the setting on the table because each symbol on the table has a meaning in the Kwanzaa table. So I'm going to stand up to do this part. It's easier to do it that way. And first important thing to understand about Kwanzaa is that all products on the Kwanzaa table should be of natural fabrication. No steel, no metal, no glass, no plastic, because this is all connected to earth. Our original traditions as African people before we enslaved. And I want you to understand something else about our ancestors. They brought skills to the Americas with them. Our ancestors who experienced that ma'afa, which is the African term for African slave holocaust, they were farmers, they were blacksmiths, they were culinary artists, they were animal husbandry individuals who understood cattle and raised cattle and did all of that stuff. They were musicians, they were artists, they were poets, they were wise people, they were literate in their own language and their own traditions. You know, they came here with an ethnic background and then they lost that ethnic background was erased. However, nowadays, you can get that back through AfricanAncestry.com. African ancestry can actually take you back to the exact ethnic group that you come from. I know because I took the DNA test. I was willing to pay the money to find out that my mother's people are the Mende people in Sierra Leone, specific ethnic group, not a general geographic location. And my father's group are the Bamileke Hausa people in the Cameroon. That's his origin. And the test goes back 500 years, the DNA test. So ethnic group, I know exactly where my parents' origins were on the African continent. That becomes important. As I said before, all natural products. The first thing I want to talk about is the mkeka, which is the straw mat. That's the first important aspect of the Kwanzaa setting. The mkeka represents our cultural historical foundation. All people have cultural historical foundations. They may not know what it is, but they have them. So you just can't sit up and say, well, I'm black or white. I'm white. Your folks came from somewhere else in Europe, on the African continent, and they had a cultural process that they were involved in that process before they came to the Western Hemisphere. So culture and history is a foundation for us as people. And unless we know our historical foundation, starting with ancient Egypt, then we really don't know who we are. Because only when you know that you have produced civilization can you reproduce civilization within your own definition of self-determination. So you want to include African people, created ancient Egypt, Kemet, as they called it, Songhai, Mali, Zulu Nation, the Ashanti people, the Kikuyu people, all these people, history, culture, ritual, tradition. That is your foundation. If you don't have that foundation, then you're just blowing in the wind. The second important item is the kinara, which is the wooden candle holder for the Kwanzaa candles. The kinara represents the mother and the father. The mother and father stand on the culture and tradition. So therefore, you don't ask other people to teach your children their history and their culture. You do it because you're responsible for it. And if you're young and you don't have children, when you do have children, you're still responsible for it. Because when children don't have a foundation, they don't love themselves. They cannot love themselves. They cannot be proud in the world if they don't know who they are and where they have come from. And they cannot build on that until they learn who they are and where they have come from and be proud of it. So the mother and father principle is important that stands on the culture. You notice that you have the Mishu Masaba, the 7 candles that are in the Kanara. Because the mother and father must practice the Nguzo Saba in order to raise their children in such a way that their children will be proud and make a connection and learn how to work with other children to create the community that we are supposed to have and create for ourselves as a people who love each other. So each candle represents one of the 7 principles that are lit, one a night. Mazao are the crops. Because Kwanzaa is based on an agrarian cultural process, because African people were agrarian, they were farmers and they were herders. They understood the universe through farming and herding. So therefore, the ingathering process is our harvest. The fruit that is here, the vegetables that you might have, represents our celebration of the goodness that we have brought into the world this year. Goodness. That's important. Not badness, goodness. It represents, we celebrate ourselves for all the good that we have brought into the year. And if you think about it, you done anything decent for anybody just because you did it, that was goodness. So we celebrate the goodness we bring to ourselves. We celebrate the goodness we bring to other people because we are good people. Don't have to explain it. Don't have to justify it. We are good people. So we celebrate ourselves. We celebrate our parents. We celebrate our children. We celebrate our brothers and sisters, cousins, uncles and aunts, grandparents. We celebrate all of that. That's us. Mazao. Then you have the muhindi, the corn. The corn represents children. Each ear of corn should be the number of children that you have in the family. You should put an ear of corn on the table to represent that child in the family, because they are the future, depending on what you do here. And if you don't have children, you're single, you still put an ear of corn out, simply because in African tradition, no matter what adult you are responsible for every child within your sight. Now, you may ignore that responsibility, but that responsibility doesn't ignore you, because they are watching you every day, how you behave, what you think about, what you say, and they are either mimicking it or going against it. So children are tape recorders. They're, what you call it, they scan everything. They don't say necessarily anything, but they watch the whole time. And then when they start to manifest certain behaviors, they're going to manifest behaviors that are either productive or unproductive based on how they've seen you. But an ear of corn, if you don't have children, you're still responsible for having one ear of corn out on the table, the Kwanzaa table. The Kikombe Cha Umoja, the unity cup. The unity cup is done for libation purposes during Kwanzaa. In our family, we also have, when we're having a family gathering for the Kwanzaa evening, we will take the unity cup as a commitment. We will drink from the cup as a commitment to practicing the principle in the new year. We'll talk about the principle. We'll talk about what commitment we're going to make to the principle. And then we will seal the principle drinking from the cup, starting with the eldest elder in the group, all the way down to everybody else in the family. And if it's a mixed group, we will only ask the elder, the oldest person in the room, to drink from the cup to help us recommit, reaffirm our practice of the Nguzo Saba for the year to come. The other items that normally we have on the table include the bendera, which is the red, black, and green flag. If any of you know about ancestor Marcus Garvey, he created the red, black, and green flag in the mid 1900s. And the colors are the red, black, and green. The black represents the people. And ancestor Garvey did this for African people worldwide. Read upon his history. The black represents the people. The red represents our blood sacrifice and our continued commitment to struggle for the greater good. And the green represents our prosperity when we continue to struggle for the greater good. and work toward together, we are prosperous. So that's what the green stands for. So usually you have a bandera that will also be on the table. And then you also have a copy of the Nguzo Saba that should be on the table somewhere where everybody can see it visibly. Other items that you normally have on the day of Kumba, which is the day of celebration, which is the second to the last, second to the last day of Kwanzaa. It's a fun time. And it's a time when people can get together, they can do poetry, they can sing, they tell stories, they read stories, they laugh, they talk, they share food. And the food comes from African American dishes, Caribbean dishes, continental African dishes, and we're all having a good time with each other as the celebration at that time. And at the same time, we have what we call zawadis, which means gifts, that are given to the children who have practiced the Nguzo Saba throughout the year. Now, we're not talking about Christmas wrap stuff from Macy's, Target, Walmart, and all that crazy stuff. These are cultural gifts they are given. And you don't give them but a couple. For one thing, you make sure if the child has practiced the Nguzo Saba, and the only way a child will practice the Nguzo Saba if they see you practice it and teach it and live it. We give them a cultural item, a piece of African jewelry, and we make sure they get a book on some type of African culture, history, aspect of history or culture, because again, we're going back to the Mkeka. Children got to have a cultural foundation. You're going to give them something to read, give them something to read where they see themselves, the power of themselves, and the power of themselves as a collective group of powerful people. So those are the only two items you give them the reward for having practiced the Nguzo Saba in the family and in the community and in the neighborhood. So basically, that's what happens on the day of Kumba, that's the celebration time. Finally, the other thing that we do during that time is that we make our commitment, Latamsi Tuta Nana, which is the last statement, which is in the book of Kwanzaa, the book I brought with me that is the authoritative book on Kwanzaa by Dr. Karanga, right here. The last day of Kwanzaa, a day of Imani, is a day of meditation. It is a quiet day. It is a day to reflect on the Nguzo Saba. It is a day to reflect on how we can bring goodness into the world to each other. And by the way, if we bring goodness into the world to each other people automatically get that byproduct. That's another thing to understand. If you do good, if it is your nature to do what's right, whether you're an African person or not, and an African person is doing right, you're going to benefit from what that African person is doing that is right. Because they're doing what is right. They're doing what is universally right. So therefore, we meditate on doing the right and doing the good in the world in the new year, starting with January 1st. And we start the cycle all over again until we get to another Kwanzaa. Kwanzaa is a powerful process more than some people think it is. And I can testify that my wife and I, 39 years, we have been celebrating Kwanzaa. 39 years we've had time to contemplate. We've been involved in community Kwanzaas, organizational Kwanzaas, Kwanzaas throughout San Diego County. I've taken Kwanzaa wherever I have taken Kwanzaa and shared it with people who are not African people because I am proud of Kwanzaa. But I can only be proud of something that I know. See, I didn't hesitate with you all up here today. I explained everything. I went through everything, didn't stutter because it is what I practice. So I don't have to stutter about it because it's what I practice. And because I practice it, whatever I do professionally, always includes the Nguzo Saba, whether I talk about it or not. I was a supervisor for the Department of Rehabilitation for the state of California until I retired a couple of years ago. I ran my office based on the principles of the Nguzo Saba without any of my staff ever knowing. Because they were my values, I understood how to bring people together to work for the greater good and to look after their interests as well as my interests to make sure that we ran things well. And if we ran things well, people who came in to get our services would feel like they were welcome and they would get good services. So this is just the thing that gives us the understanding of where we go from year to year. What we do with it has to be internalized that it's so second nature, we don't have to think about it twice in our lives. And if it's not second nature, you don't know how to practice Kwanzaa. That's simple. And it takes time. Yes, we never got it right. Let me tell you, this is 39 years of experience with Kwanzaa. When we first were introduced to Kwanzaa, we had no idea as young adults with a baby and a child and an infant, a baby and a child. We just knew that the concept blew us away. It was okay, how do we get bits and pieces of this to make it work? And we got bits and pieces every year until we got comfortable to the point where now I can have a conversation with you today about Kwanzaa. At this time, I'm going to ask, are there any questions about Kwanzaa? Anything that I haven't covered? Anything that you'd like to know that I haven't covered? Oh, I'm glad. See, that's the reason why your better half is here with me. My better half. How you light the candles is very important. Final aspect. Not really. Not really. First day, you light the black candle, umoja. By the way, usually it's the youngest people in the family. If it's children, you have your children light the candle. If it's a young adult, they light the candle. The younger people, one takes it, one lights the black candle. The second day, you come back, the day of self-determination, Kujichagulia, you light the emoji candle again, then you light the red candle, which represents Kujichagulia. Come back the third day, black candle, red candle, green candle, Ujima. Come back again the next day, black candle, red candle, green candle, red candle. Of course, that's Ujamaa. Then you do the same thing until you come up with the Imani. 1, 2, 3, and you go back until you end up lighting the last candle. But you alternate each time, each day, until on the day of Imani, all the candles are lit. And you light the candles before you begin your Kwanzaa ceremony. You start out by lighting your candle. And then you can have different ways that you can celebrate Kwanzaa. For some groups, for instance, you have the family gathering. Every family will not do it the same way. Families will have different ways of doing it. In community groups, if you're having a community group that's celebrating Kwanzaa, the first day, some people may have a panel discussion about what unity is, how it works. Have elders up there on the table, others who have been involved in activism, talking about community issues that deal with unity. I know in our organization, the Pan-African Association of America, the first night would be a big night in which we invite people from different African cultures, along with African Americans in the Caribbean, to do different performances as we talked about unity, bringing all people together, because Kwanzaa is a Pan-African holiday. It's not just African American. We include all African people in it. So we celebrate all African people. We want to make sure that we include, if we got brothers and sisters from Somalia, Ethiopia, Ghana, South Africa, Cameroon, whatever, we try to make sure that our first night of Kwanzaa, we included all those people to come in, have something to say, or do some type of cultural performance, because we were inclusive in our community Kwanzaa. And we then You know, we have one brother in San Diego who's a capoeira master. He bring his school to the program to perform. Another brother, master drummer in Teisachatan, West African drumming. We'd end the program with the drumming and the dance. Then the second day we'd have for self-determination, we'd have a different activity as an organization. We'd have naming ceremony where people who wanted to take on African names. And we would have them 6 months before that provide us with the information of who they were, their experiences, maybe talk to family members. Then we would choose the name to give them on the day of Kujichagulia. And the names would be connected to that. The one thing we never encouraged was an individual to name him or herself, simply because, you know, with our egos, we have a tendency to want to give ourselves names that don't reflect actually who we are so much as what we'd like to think we are. So we'd have a naming ceremony that day. The third day, Ujima, we'd have a food drive. Again, we'd have a panel. We'd be going around the community collecting food, dry foods and things for people in our neighborhoods, for families that didn't have anything. And we want to make sure that the food got distributed by the churches or by whatever. We make sure we have a food drive. Then cooperative economics, another time you have people who are in business, entrepreneurs, sit down and talk about the process of how we work together economically. So each day there's a different thing that you can do. It's not just one thing out. That's where your Kumba cake comes in, your real creativity, where you think about, okay, this is how we're going to do it. This is what we're going to do this time. Creativity. So these are all aspects of Kwanzaa that become important for you to understand. I don't expect for any and everybody to pick this up right away, but pick up a little piece. Because if you pick up a little piece one year, you pick up another little piece another year, and the year after that, next thing you know, you're going to be talking to a group of people about Kwanzaa where you're committed to it. And I want to emphasize this again. Kwanzaa is a cultural holiday. We don't care what your belief system is. You're still African people and we love you. We don't care what your political position is. You're still African people and we love you. We don't care what your gender identity is. You're still African people and we love you. We don't care because you know one thing, if we don't love each other, ain't no way we're going to protect each other. And if people don't protect themselves are always lost, and history has proven it time and time again for a long time. So the final part of Kwanzaa that I want to talk to you about is the Harambee. Harambee means let's pull together. So every time you hear Harambee, you are saying let's pull together. Because if we don't pull together, we can't get nothing out of it unless we're pulling together. And at Kwanzaa, every time you do a Kwanzaa, you do 7 Harambees. Every night you do 7 Harambees for Kwanzaa. And the 7th Harambee is the loudest Harambee. And what you do is you reach with your hand up high, you pull it down into a fist, and you say, Harambee, 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 Harambee. That's Kwanzaa. So do we have time? If anybody has a question, I'd like to, any questions? Hopefully I've covered. Yes, sir. Once a year, 7 days, 7 days, the last 7 days of the year from the 26th of December to January 1st. Yes, sir.
For our listeners, could you just repeat the question?
Oh, wanted to know, young man wanted to know how often do we celebrate Kwanzaa? I said once a year we celebrate it for 7 days, starting with December 26th to January 1st.
Why were those dates chosen?
Those dates were chosen because at that time, the organization, us, did not want to compete with people who were interested in celebrating Christmas. And and the organization wanted to make sure that people had an opportunity, if they were Christian, to celebrate Christmas, and yet at the same time, be able to give their full attention to Kwanzaa once Christmas was over. So those dates were chosen. It wasn't an either or, it was an and, respecting the fact that we have many of our people who are Christians, so we give them the opportunity. And then not only that, we had people who celebrated Kwanzaa, who were Christian and who are Christian, that wanted to make sure they didn't get the two entangled when one dealt with their religious beliefs and the other dealt with their collective identity as a people. Any other question? Thank you for that question. Kiswahili was selected as the language by Dr. Karanga. How was the language selected for Kwanzaa? First of all, it's Kiswahili. Swahili is spoken in about roughly 8 East African nations. They have different versions, but they can all understand each other. So Kiswahili seemed the language, the most universal that African people could have to talk to each other, and therefore Swahili was chosen as the language to be used for all of the Kwanzaa terminology. So every time you speak in Swahili. Yes, sir.
Curious about your outfit. Explain or tell us a little bit about that.
Well, it's traditional. My outfit is traditional African clothing. I don't know. It's like asking somebody to explain why they're in a suit and tie. Same difference. It's traditional clothing. Well, that's all I can say is suited for the African continent, and anybody who is not self-conscious about being African to wear it. I mean, I wear African clothing once or twice a week, or when I'm going to do things, I will wear African clothing simply because it's a part of my cultural process, and I'm comfortable with it. Mm-hmm. I think first of all, you always have to put things within historical and cultural context. First of all, our ancestors who came over here spoke a lot of different African languages until it was brutally uh, exercised out of them. So a lot of our folks were speaking Mende, they were speaking Bambara, they were speaking Wolof, they were speaking Twi, they were speaking Yoruba, they were speaking all of these Congo, they were speaking all of these different languages. And so we lost all that, we lost the mother tongue. As a result, when you have to reconstruct a cultural process, you have to go for something that makes the best sense at the time. At that time, as I said before, when Dr. Karamba created Kwanzaa, he was a young African American man. This was in the 60s, and we didn't have access to a lot of different African languages in 1966. So he had to come with the language that at that time was most accessible. You know, we can't learn African languages unless our African brothers and sisters start language schools and teach them to us. You can't grab them out of the air. So at that time, he did the best he could with what he had, and he created Kwanzaa. And as I said before, the rationale was to use Swahili. Now, we use other words. You notice if you were here for the libation, we use Yoruba words for that, for doing our libation. And we also used a Bambara word in the libation. So for those of us who, the historical diaspora, we can use any African language we choose in the first place because we didn't voluntarily come here, and so we got to reconstitute what we can to make ourselves feel comfortable with each other. However, language is very powerful because language describes concepts and thoughts. And anybody who speaks more than one language understands that you cannot translate literally some things from one language to another because they don't exist in that language. So therefore, it is important to understand that when you reconstruct a language, an African language, you're reconstructing a philosophical thought process that doesn't necessarily exist in Western culture. So therefore, the idea is to reintroduce African languages to African people in America so we begin to reconstruct our thought and concept process, understanding that it's not universal. Some things exist in some languages that don't. For instance, in some traditional African languages, there is no word for uncle and aunt, mother and father, grandmother, grandfather. That's it. And everybody in the village is referred to in that way. So we used various African languages as we reconstruct ourselves in our Kujichagulia or self-determination. Hopefully that answered your question. Good. Yes, sir.
Service, sir.
Mm-hmm.
Could you tell me a little bit about your experience in the service and in relation to African roots?
Well, I took my culture with me when I joined the military. I didn't leave it at home. And branch of service, I was in the United States Navy. And I took my culture with me. As a matter of fact, my participation in the United States Navy, I could not avoid bringing my cultural process to Black History Month. I was committed to it. When I was younger, I did some volunteer service with one of the base newspapers in Jacksonville, Florida, where I was stationed. A community service. In my spare time, different articles I did on the military base on my own time. Nothing to do with rank, rating, or anything like that. And so the values that I brought with me, I found served me well in being able to achieve what I wanted to achieve while I was active duty in the Navy.
Question, sir. You talked about celebrations each night during Kwanzaa.
Mm-hmm.
How important is the timing to that celebration? Like, does it start at sunset, or is there a certain timing to start?
It depends on when the family agrees to it. There's no set time. The family has to agree to the time that they want to all come together to sit down and have whatever it is they're going to do that Kwanzaa day. Could be morning, evening, noon, whatever works. Whatever works. Any other questions? I want to thank all you beautiful people out here today for giving me the time to share Kwanzaa with you. The one thing I can say about Kwanzaa that I want to leave you with is that it permits African people to get together, to love each other unconditionally, because we all need love. We all do better when we are loved. And it permits those who love us to share in that love that we get with each other, because if we get it from each other, everybody else is going to get it too. Asante Sana. Thank you very much.
I want to thank all you beautiful people too for being here. And I hope that there is something that each one of you can take away from this today and remembering that we are doing this today because December 26th, y'all won't be here, right? And so what I'm hoping though is December 26th through January 1, there's something here, just like Brother Baye said, it might be one thing you take away today, but as a people, there is something here that we all can benefit from, especially the part about love, right? All of us can benefit from that. So thank you again for being here. We hope that you will stay and partake and enjoy some lunch with us that is served in the back. Is there anything you want me to close in the particular thing you want me to say? No. Okay. All right then. Well, I'm going to ask Ricky Toft to kind of help us with the getting folks over there. You can just get up and go if that works. But if yes, Ricky will direct folks. But please enjoy lunch. It is a cultural relevant lunch, I guess is what I would say. It's representative of the diaspora of Black folks. So thank you again for being here.
Thank you.
Oh, elders